Welcome back. I'm Rebecca Bender, and this is Trafficking Truths, our Mythbuster campaign. Today, we are talking about myth number 3, the myth that trafficking only happens to kids overseas, right? Actually, you would be surprised who is at risk for human trafficking in your very own community. We are bringing back today special guest, Senior Deputy District Attorney Mikko Anderson, to share for the first time how her daughter was actually trafficked while she was a prosecuting attorney. We're also bringing on special guest, survivor, leader, advocate, and activist Tara Madison from Florida, as well as Department of Justice Human Trafficking Task Force Coordinator Amanda Swanson. Welcome. Today, I am so excited to bring you guys special guest, survivor, leader, activist, advocate, Tara Madison from Florida. Tara, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you're here. Share with everybody, we've been having all of our guests when they come on for the first time, share a little bit about your professional experience. When we say activist and advocate, people may or may not know what that means. Can you give us a little bio real quick? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure. So I've been, as far as in the anti-trafficking movement, I've been working in the anti-trafficking movement full time for about 6 years. I started doing international work. I went to Cambodia, Southeast Asia with a couple different nonprofits. Then actually, after that experience, I came home and I just really felt that it was time to do domestic work. And that's where I needed to be. So I spent a few years doing direct service. The whole 6 years that I've been working in the anti-trafficking, I've been doing direct service with survivors. I was doing crisis response and court advocacy. I was in court almost every day, typically with minors ages 12 to 18 was the main age of the population I worked with. And now I am the coordinator for Elevate Academy.
Yes, and for those of you that don't know, Elevate Academy is the school that I created. So Tara works with us, and we're so happy that she's here. I haven't talked about that this much on any of these episodes, but if you want to share with everyone a little bit about Elevate, we haven't really shared much about it, so go ahead.
No, not at all. So Elevate Academy is an online self-paced school environment that was created specifically for survivors. There's some courses that we call deeper levels that are trauma healing, trauma based, and then also there's a lot of really great professional development courses on there. Obviously, for all of us who have been trafficked, we miss a lot of those critical years when we learn how to build a resume and how to do an interview and all those things. So we discuss a lot of that inside the academy. I went through the academy in 2014, and it was just life changing for me. Doing the deeper levels course was the first time. It was the first time I ever did any kind of healing work that was specifically targeted for survivors of sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked the gamut in terms of demographic. You've worked 12 all the way up to, we have, people probably in their 50s, if not 60s in Elevate. We've had, and so all the ages in between. You've worked crisis response, court advocacy, direct service. Tell people what direct service means for those that are kind of tuning in and just starting to learn about this issue. When you hear the term direct service, what does that mean?
Sure. So direct service is kind of like a case management situation. So I'd be working with a survivor, basically doing day in, day out life with them, helping them to set up services, resources, providing transportation for them, because most of them do not have transportation when they first get out of the life, and helping them through the court piece of it is helping them understand the process, the judicial process, and what they're facing. What I was dealing with specifically, and what I'm very passionate about working on in this movement, is with minors. All of our minors are being criminalized. So we have minors who are being sex trafficked that are catching other charges while they're being trafficked, whether it be possession, looting, grand theft auto. That's happening due to their trafficking, but nobody's looking at the trafficking. So these kids are in a chronic cycle of being incarcerated. like every 30 days, incarcerated, picked up, incarcerated, picked up, incarcerated, and they're not being released to services because nobody's recognizing what's happening. So that's been a big part of my job as an advocate, is to step into courtrooms and develop relationships with prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, be like, hey, this is really what's going on underneath the surface. Like what we're seeing is just the top. We're not seeing the underside of the iceberg, and that's that this young man or young lady are being trafficked. Earlier, and I think it was when you were doing like myth 1 or myth 2, when you talked about like kidnapping, like what does it really look like domestically, in child sex trafficking, I will tell you that every child that I have worked with in the United States is either in foster care with their biological parents and are in a group home and are being trafficked. They go to school every day. They go home and eat dinner. They're being trafficked in between the time that they're recruited at school until their parents get home from work. And that's what we're seeing. And that chronic runaway that we see is most of the time a sex trafficking case because of survival sex, which is something that we talk about when we talk about minors.
You know, some of the things, I know you and I have talked about this, we talk about it a lot. You know, my kids are very wide spectrum of ages, from 5, 6. I keep saying 5. She like just turned 6. And every time I'm like, oh, I'm at 5. And she's like, I'm 6. Sorry, I haven't got it ready yet, you know? But from 5, 6 to 20 is a big gap. And so what I'm teaching my little ones about stranger danger and gaming and online apps and watching their screen time and putting devices on, and sometimes, you know, having to talk to family or friends when they go over to their house, like, hey, so we don't allow them to download this game or this game, you know, we just especially because of the work we do, we see games that come up or apps or social media sites that come up in case investigation more than others. But then to my 20-year-old, right? Like 20-year-olds are still at risk for being trafficked. Your brain isn't fully formed until you're close to 25 in terms of cognitive reasoning, right? And so some stuff that I, you know, tell her as a young adult, late in her high school, early in college, that like 17 to 22, is to figure out when you feel uncomfortable in a situation, to have them rehearse ways to get out of that with you. Like it's so subtle, like you talked about, it's this gradual grooming. And so it's never going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm suddenly trapped and I need help. It's never going to feel like that to the teenager, ever. It's going to feel like, oh shoot, someone's putting their hand on my leg and I'm uncomfortable because that was my friend's dad. And they brought me here and I don't have a ride now and I don't know what to do. And so they freeze. And it's just that one little gradual, tiny push after push after push until they're in a situation that they're embarrassed to come talk about. And I feel like people are missing that so much. How do you teach your kids to get out of uncomfortable situations? How do you start early having hard conversations? What are some tips you can give for parents in all of these age demographics?
Well, in terms of being a service provider with trafficking survivors and doing safety plans, the part of a safety plan, especially with that like preteen, you know what I mean, to young adult age, was to always have an exit plan. If you go to a friend's house and your friend is driving, you know, is your mom going to be available to pick you up if something happens and you're uncomfortable and you want to leave? And can you have an honest relationship like that with your mom and dad? To be like, hey, I just don't feel right. I need to come home. You know, children that did have licenses and had vehicles, I told them always go in your own vehicle, because then you always have your exit plan in place. We also, you know, would always work on a lot of different strategies with like code words and stuff like that. You know, it's just, so if they were texting on the phone with a parent or like an advocate, that if they're with someone who is exploiting them, you know, the exploiter wouldn't understand the conversation. Keeping location services on is critical. And for the child, because a lot of times teenagers don't want their parents to know where they are, and we understand that. But if something was to go down and that location service is on, it's going to be, you know, much quicker recovery. So the crutch of it is it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the hardest part in safety planning, developing strategy to get out if you go into that fight, flight, or freeze. To talk about this openly with parents and their children in the same room was very few and far between that I could get families that would meet in that space. And if you can't meet in that space with your kids are going to be hiding a lot from you. And if they do feel that shame, like you were talking about, you're the last person they're going to go to.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. My daughter, we put a shared ride app on. Obviously, we all know it's either Uber or Lyft. There's not really many other options, but we put one on her phone when she was probably 15 or 16, as like an emergency, you know, hey, if you need to get out, if you want to get out of that any situation, you're not feeling comfortable, I want you to make sure that you can. Mainly too, though, she started traveling as an athlete on her own at 16, mainly because I'm such a busy working mom, which is always hard because it actually puts your kids at risk for feeling, unseen. And so this isn't easy. The stuff we're talking about isn't easy. Conversations aren't easy. Talking to my daughter about how to get out of situations you don't feel comfortable with, like, hey, let's just role play. Like, what would you say if you're feeling uncomfortable? What would you say to a friend? I want you to just, talk through it right now. Like, oh, I forgot I was supposed to do something for my mom, or just having them have an excuse ready in their brain that they feel okay saying to a peer. Sometimes they're just like, and then they end up staying because they don't know what to say. I mean, it's little things like that will help create opportunity for your kid to be aware. And I think that communication is so key. A lot of people have asked me back in the day, like when we would do trainings at high schools, do you not let your daughter have any boyfriends? And what age does your daughter get to date boys? And you've got to be the strictest parent. And I mean, my daughter will tell you that I've scared her, but I definitely wasn't strict, because I wanted my kids to talk to me. And she would come home, and because I wasn't as strict in terms of like, yeah, you can hang out till midnight. Yeah, I just make sure that you're safe. Remember who you are, stuff like that. She would come to me and say, oh, so-and-so has a boyfriend, but she's not supposed to date, and they won't tell her parents. I'm thinking, wouldn't you rather have your kid come to you than them hiding things behind your back? Like, that's what creates, secrecy and things like that. So what about younger kids? What can parents do if they have elementary to middle school age? What are some ways that predators are how can we protect our kids?
Supervision is a big one. I mean, culturally, things are just so different nowadays, right? You have like both people in the home working, children are home by themselves for extensive amount of times. And again, the devices. You see toddlers with tablets going on YouTube and, being exposed to things. A lot of times with younger children, it seems like a lot of the grooming starts with pornography. And pornography is so accessible online. It's so easy for someone to send your child a porn video, pictures, anything like that. And, with a younger population, it seems like we see the entire grooming process happening online, up until a meet point.
Yep.
But the big issue with all of this, as far as my experience in the work that I do, is simply that I wasn't able to be in a place where I could do a lot of safety planning with families and with survivors, because by the time we stepped in, it was complete crisis. It was crisis response. And why was it crisis response? Because before those things happened, the conversations didn't happen. Just like you were saying, you were very open with your daughter, right? Like that has to happen before the first time that they're in a vulnerable position and uncomfortable with an adult or another teenager.
Take some internet safety classes. Just Google internet safety. There can be classes online right now with COVID. There's a ton of internet safety classes online. There's we see them offered at our high school at least once a quarter. But you've got to go look for it, and you got to go take it and take your kid and do it together and figure it. And, we got to put some effort in to really learning the right red flags so that we can protect our kids. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Senior Deputy District Attorney of Fresno County, Mikko Anderson. If you don't mind switching gears with me a little bit to talk about kind of who's at risk and who's generally at risk. And as you share some of that, you have your own kind of personal testimony, so to speak, personal lived experience through people who are at risk. And I don't know, what you're comfortable sharing with our listeners today to really paint that totality of circumstance. And I think is really important when we consider who's at risk in our communities and how we can serve them better and how we can be more alert and aware to what's going on in our very own areas. I think your personal backstory really relates a lot with that.
Definitely. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to be able to at least include this is because as part of that myth busting topic that you have, that the profile of a victim, while there are some victims who are maybe targeted more frequently because of their circumstance, and what I mean by that is maybe youth, homeless youth especially, those who have suffered sexual assaults and different type of trauma are targeted more frequently, but they are not the only targets, and they're not, there's no situation where a particular victim is like insulated from this happening. So as it relates to like families and parents and the community in general, to know that my personal story is that my daughter was trafficked, and she was trafficked at the age of, she just turned 18. And this was in probably 2014. And it's been a really long road with that. And that is how I was introduced to what trafficking is. Not through law school, not through a class, not through, a prosecutor's training class or a new assignment. It was at home where I had to put two and two together and figure out what's happening and try to figure out whether or not these were her personal choices, what had happened. We had a normal family. I was a single parent, so there was always that. But we had, nothing traumatic that I could put a finger on to kind of attribute it to. But yet it still happened. So that's why it's so important that, parents and community members in general are vigilant about just really kind of trying to catch the red flags and see whatever vulnerabilities their loved ones or other community members may have, and try to help it on that end so they won't be as susceptible to trafficking.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the red flags that you felt like you noticed with your daughter and that you would encourage other parents to look for in their own homes?
I think when it started, her emotional state, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride. And she had she just turned 18. And I kind of chalked it up to her being just, emotional, that was her personality. I didn't really recognize that there was trauma or something else behind it, but I did notice that it was more intense. Mm-hmm. The fact that she had different friends who she didn't introduce me to, who I didn't know. Not having, one of the things that I really missed, and it's a big thing, was not really engaging or any real contact or presence with her personal social media accounts, anything of that nature. At that time, this was 2014, I really just thought, I didn't see the danger that I see now in social media. And so not having any awareness of that. And then the secrecy as far as who she was hanging out with, not just that I wasn't able to meet people, but just there was a secrecy about how she communicated when she was on the phone. It was always separate, and just moving in a way that was not the way she normally moved. And it's kind of hard to articulate, but when you're a parent and you're in the house with the child, you know how they normally are, and there are changes that they're going to experience, but then you also kind of have to be aware if there's something that's just deserves like a second, more critical look.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. It reminds me, with any type of grooming behavior, whether it's child abuse or exploitation in its variety of forms. But it reminds me of, when we see and hear about children who have been molested, sometimes, obviously when it's someone outside of the home, the parents have noticed like they became more emotional here, or they started doing, and at first it's like, well, is it hormonal? Or are they going through? And so it is hard to really identify. I have one daughter that's way more emotional than the other four, or the other three, four total. And when maybe last year, we were in the bedroom and she came in and flopped herself on the bed and bawling, started crying and saying, I'm never going to be a good mother. You're like, you're 7. Like, what are you talking about? And so if she were having a heightened emotional response, I don't know that I would notice, because she is already a fairly emotional kid. So those are really astute things. How did you finally realize what was the catalyst that made you realize something else is going on?
Oh, it was so, it happened in a way that was just so hard to really recount, because initially when it happened, I thought that she was just being difficult. I thought she was rebelling. I thought she left, and I didn't know that she left our immediate area because she answered an ad on Craigslist that said that she could make, too much money for doing too little work. Okay, so I didn't know that that's why she had left, but I knew she left because she couldn't take it anymore. And it was so hard because all my friends and family were like, well, she's young, she has to find her way, just, let her be hands off. But something in me was like, okay, but you don't know. So it's like, is this just being a thing where she has to fall on her own and I step back, or is there something else going on? So at that point, I'm like, okay, well, I'm a fall on her own. There hadn't been enough red flags, at least that I strung together in my mind to know. So she left, and when I would try to call her, she would never answer, and she would only communicate with me back via text, never a voice call. So that was a red flag. And that happened over and over and over again. And then she would send me like texts that you could tell were like little cries for help, but not really, randomly. And then luckily for me in this case, there was someone who was later determined to be another victim, although these people have never actually been identified, who actually physically called me and said, you need to come, because she was having a psychological breakdown too, but to say, you need to come and get your daughter. She's involved in prostitution. She doesn't know that this person will not let her go. And you need to come and get her. And we're in this location in Las Vegas is where we went.
Wow.
And at that time, like this just was crazy. At that time, I was working gang prosecution. So I had like gang cases, and it's hard because that's how it, like for any parent or anybody who knows, like when something hits you, it doesn't hit you when you have still moments. It hits you when you're smack dab in the middle of a regular busy life and you're trying to figure out what's going on and you don't really know. So at that time, I had to leave, and I want to say it was like such a weird time where I think I was like I might have been in a court hearing and got the text, and I'm like questioning a witness, and I'm like, oh man, what? And I'm questioning, it was like that kind of like, this could not be happening right now. So once that was finished and I figured out what was going on, I actually made a voice call and called this person back to make sure I understood what was happening. I left work, and we meaning I, because I'm a single parent, drove to Las Vegas. I did stop off though and pick up her father, who rode with me, and we drove to Las Vegas, and we recovered her, and she was just completely like withdrawn and flat from that experience. And I thought that was the end of it, but really that was truly just the beginning of everything that took, like, this is 2020 and that happened in 14. I would say 2019, mid 19 is when you could really see effects of like recovery and healing. Like it took
5
that
years.
Yeah, it took a long time. I mean, we had about where she was in a psych ward. And she has given me permission to discuss this. I never share her name, but she's already given me permission to discuss the facts of it. But there were, you know, like she had really traumatic psychological effects to where she didn't recognize me. She had a psychological, would you call it a psychosis, a break from reality? Like it was very difficult. So when we had our victim who was breaking down on the stand,
I bet that was so hard.
Like instinctively, I think everybody in the room knew. You didn't have to have personal experience to know that one. But I knew, like, this is hands off. We got to prove this case without her being involved in it any further, because she just couldn't. It was just too big of a burden for her to have to face. So what I can say, I guess the short story, if it's short, is that that the I want to say, like, what is that saying? Like it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the road back to like being healthy is not one that's just, okay, you've been recovered, you got counseling, go and be happy. It doesn't happen, because it's such a traumatic effect. And it's like, it's spiritual. I believe that. But it's such a traumatic effect that it takes a long time to get back whole and to be healthy.
I'm so honored that you're sharing all of this, and I have so many emotions running through me. I know you're getting emotional. Like, we can see people that aren't going to be watching to see the emotion on your face, to think about, I mean, you know, here you are, you're a prosecutor, right? Prosecuting attorney who is in the middle, who's, you know, like, you're trained and stuff, right? And so I think that's partly, it can happen to anybody's kids. Like you were trained on what to look for. You knew, not just in trafficking specific, but you know, like, you work with law enforcement and detectives, and you get cases in front of you and you're having to identify. And so, you know, you're more of a trained brain than a lot of us. And yet you could see something was wrong, but it's like, oh, they're getting 18 and kids are rebellious and kids can be emotional, and they can be hormonal. And so just checking that gut, I could not imagine that first moment of getting that text from somebody. And did they end up being, did you say it was another trafficked victim that called you? Was that what you said?
Yeah, it was another female that called me with like that tip.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, I never was able to confirm any of that, but I believe it was another victim. But she was just concerned with my daughter, because she could sense that, I guess, that her psychological breakdown was probably becoming apparent. So I just suspected it was another victim. But yeah, and then yeah, so it took a while. And one of the other things that I would say to parents, and this is one of the things that when I have cases that I really try to, when I can, make connection with parents, that it's such a difficult reality to face once you realize what it is. So figuring out what happened and recognizing it and identifying it is one hurdle, but then dealing with it in reality is another hurdle. And not just that it takes so long, but there's just automatically a built-in shame and stigma as a parent to have to explain to other people who may not see your child or family member as a victim, and you know what happened. And so I would say, and it took me a long time, and I wish I had done it earlier, I would say, you know, I have to be blunt, I would say, to hell with all that. Do not go down the shame, stigma road at all in the slightest. That it happens, and it happens across the board, that it's not necessarily nothing you can pinpoint or relate back to some misgiving you did or did not do, and to do what's best for your mental health and for the mental health of your family, and particularly the one who was most victimized. And being a prosecutor made it really difficult, because I didn't even know how to articulate to those in my office that this was happening. We didn't have a human trafficking unit at that time. And I did not know where to start. So that was a whole nother situation as to how much of this is family information that I need to keep private. It's almost like a secret, like a family secret. Like let me try to grab her, heal her privately, and go on with my life as if this didn't happen. But that was not the way to deal with it. And I tried that for a little bit, and that was the least successful way. So if I could save anybody some time when it comes to dealing with anything that is of a personal nature, that is probably beyond your own resources, is to shed the shame immediately. Because one thing that we do know is that people are people, and we have so many more common experiences than we're willing to recognize and admit. that you just delay what's going to be the inevitable. Because in order to really cleanse what's going on, it has to be brought out in the open. It just has to.
Man, thank you for being so willing to share both professionally all of the just incredible insight that you have from working cases and from training and teaching at law school and all the things, and for sharing such a personal part of your story. I'm just really grateful and honored. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Amanda Swanson. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Amanda, you wear a lot of hats. You're all over the state of Oregon, but share with people that are listening in, like your title, where you're housed, and then also share a little bit about what that role means, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the Trafficking Intervention Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Justice, which is the Oregon Attorney General's office. And I am tasked with building Oregon's response to human trafficking. So I have been in this position for almost 6 years now, and we are going around the state trying to build a sustainable response in every community that is a no wrong door approach. So no matter any county that a victim is in or a survivor is in, there is a response in place and there are services available for them, and that when they're ready, they can get out and receive services.
That's great. And I love working with you, obviously, on the DOJ level, which is very much more of a state level, because you are a part of creating this multidisciplinary response that creates toolkits for task forces to exist within every county in the state. Tell us more about that, and what other states you know that are doing things like that nationally.
So my main goal for this was, I knew that every county was so different. Oregon is really unique. We have really urban areas and we have really rural areas borderlining frontier land. And so I knew that every county was going to be really unique. And I didn't want to come in as the state saying, I know what's best. I knew what worked in some areas and I knew certain things, but I didn't know everything. And so going around to these counties, teaching them what basic trafficking looks like, learning the differences in rural versus urban versus Indian country and what that looks like, and then learning from them of where we can have consistency and what needs to be unique per each county. So giving them the freedom and the flexibility to make it their own while having consistency around the state. I know there's a lot of other states that are doing stuff like this. I know Texas and Michigan, Florida. I sit on calls with them, and I know there's actually a handful of other ones, and I apologize, I can't remember what ones they are, but I know that there's a lot of states out there that are trying to build this more of a statewide approach so that it really is more comprehensive.
So with this Mythbuster campaign, I would love to kind of, if you don't mind, go through, I'm just going to say kind of some of our myths, because you're so well versed on all this stuff, but I'd love to just kind of rapid fire some myths at you and get your kind of like feedback from them. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Do like a rapid fire round. Okay. So trafficking victims are kidnapped.
That is the exception, not the rule. It does happen, but the majority of the cases that we see, it is not kidnapped. It is somebody that they know, somebody that they trust. They could possibly even be in love with them, and they exploit the vulnerabilities of these victims and aren't always kidnapped.
Yeah. Okay, number 2 then. Trafficking victims are only children brought from overseas.
So not true. Yes, that does happen. Again, there's no absolutes, right? But the majority, I was a direct service provider for about 7 years. I was an advocate, case manager, and I worked with hundreds of victims. I can only think of 2 that were from another country. They were all local. They were all from the United States. They were all U.S. citizens. They were from our communities. So the majority of these kids are from our communities, and I know that personally from the cases that I've worked.
And just for people, just a reminder, right, of like, Amanda's like the head honcho of our DOJ task force. So all the task forces across the state report to Amanda. So when she's like gathering information from all these different locations. I mean, these are task forces that are boots on the ground. When you're doing the work, Amanda, and you're hearing about a possible brothel in someone's basement, immediately I'm going to assume that the general public pictures children handcuffed on dirty mattresses down in someone's basement. Share with me what it looks like to have an underground brothel in your community.
Unfortunately, it looks like the flop house. It looks like the party house. It looks like the house where everybody goes to party. And traffickers know that as soon as you have a runaway, drug-addicted teen, their credibility goes out the window. And so it's easier to keep victims tethered to them if they give them drugs, if they shoot them up with drugs. We're seeing kids come in off high rates that are high off meth and heroin that we've never seen before. I've seen traffickers using drugs more than I've ever seen them before, doing this work for 13 years. And so it's the party house. It's the kid that wakes up and is like, I think I had sex last night. I don't really know. I know I had drugs. And so the trafficker is bringing them in, shooting them up with drugs, and then little do they know that they are charging money for the Johns to come in and use them for sex. And so a lot of times it does look like the party house, the flop house, and it's not a 24-hour, 24/7 type thing happening. It might just be on the weekends. It might just be a certain night a week, but it is something that is continuing, and it is something that the community or the people that are in the know.
Right. And I think all of us, at least people that are listening right now, you've probably driven through parts of your community or neighborhood, or you've seen other places where you're like, oh, that's like the drug house. That's the things that we need to be looking for. Those are the things that need to get tip lines. If you hear from one of your high school friends, like, oh, my friend that's a runaway, she usually hangs out there when she runs away for the weekend. Those are the tips that need to get reported, because it's not always someone that's vanished and is being injected with drugs and held against their will. I know it can sound like that when you're like, they give them drugs but I just want people to have the right perception. My daughter's 20. She's almost a senior in college.
Oh my gosh, she's 20.
I know. I feel like I am 20, girl. What happened? 25 still. Then I see her. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm almost 40. That's lovely. But when she was in high school, she had one friend out of her group that had a really rough time and had a really rough life and was in and out of being a runaway and in and out of sleeping on everyone else's couches. And I started following her online and watching her chug alcohol at different flop houses. I immediately knew this girl is being exploited or very at risk for exploitation. But to no one else, it was like, we're looking for the kidnapped kids. And I'm like, no, this girl needs somebody. This girl needs someone to tell her she's able to get out, to provide her services and options and opportunities and maybe trauma therapy from the abuse she endured prior to even getting in these really dangerous situations. So it's so weird and so hard to watch us see people right in front of us and chalk it off as like, she's just this druggy runaway. And you're like, no, that's who traffickers are also targeting. It's hard.
It is really hard, especially when people just see them as, oh, they're just the runaway. They're just the troubled kid. They're the pain in the butt kid that will never stay put where I put them. Or they're just drunk. They're just like having sex with older men. We hear it all the time. Why are we not asking why? Like, what is going on, right? Like, kids just don't wake up one day and think, I'm going to be an alcoholic, or I'm just going to go run away all the time. Like, why are we not sitting down and saying, what is going on? Like, tell me, what is going on? And we need to start asking more questions. So
good. Really, really helpful. Okay, so the last one I want to throw at you then is, I'm calling it like my favorite one-liners myth. And there's several that come out. I'd love to hear a couple of your one-liners that people throw at you, and they mean well. I mean, the thing is right now our online communities that we're all in are just inundated with information, and it's hard to sort through like what's true, what's not true, what's a reputable source, what's not a reputable source. I don't know, but my friend Sally shared it and I trust her, so I'm going to believe it to be true. And I get that. I've done that, and I've, over the years, started to be like, wow, there's a lot of information out there. How do you decipher through what's reputable. And I say that, and I get a lot of flack for saying reputable, and people are like, well, your sources that you say are reputable aren't reputable. And I'm like, I feel like the FBI data report is pretty reputable. And then they're like, well, they missed Epstein the first time. They're not reputable. They can't be trusted. I'm like, okay, yeah, he had connections. He's not the average buyer. So let's calm down. And so I'm not asking for one-liners to make anyone feel bad who has heard these or used these or reshared these by any means. I have in my day too, but I feel like the more we get inundated with information, the easier it is to become really confused. So share with me what some of those that are kind of myths that are floating around there are. And then I'd love for us to talk about how to find good data.
Right. I think some of the biggest myths that I hear are, it doesn't happen here. It only happens in the big city, right? It's not here. We're safe. It would never happen in my community. I hear that all the time, especially in our small communities, right? Some of the other myths that I've heard is that, well, Super Bowl is the biggest myth or the biggest place that trafficking happens, right? It's like, well, there's probably there's trafficking that happens there, but anytime you get a lot of people together in one area, there's a uptick in demand, and they're gonna bring a supply in. So that could be any sports event. We've just only looked at the Super Bowl. It could be the Olympic trials. It could be political events. It could be other big events. Yeah. March Madness, different things like that. So we've only been looking at the Super Bowl, but what if we looked at other ones?
Yeah, and there's not actually a ton of data that shows the monitoring of online ads at multiple cities during multiple events to make this big collaborative like data report. And people think that it's game city, like people are just trucking in loads and loads of children for Super Bowl. And I'm like, okay, there's no data to prove that. But exactly like you say, I always say anywhere where large groups of men congregate, you're going to see an increase in exploitation. But we're not comparing that to like the Consumer Electronics Show in Houston, right? But we should, because there's a lot of trafficking at CES. And the Stockholders Convention in Los Angeles, major trafficking. And no one's comparing that increase to the same rates of the increase on game day. With everything that's coming at us, what would you suggest the average person that's just starting to learn about this issue? They've seen stuff online and they're like, wow, I'm hearing it's conspiracy. I'm hearing it's not conspiracy. I don't know who to believe. Where do they go to begin this process of really learning about the issue? And then how do they become good filters of like what to swipe left, what to swipe right on?
I think definitely looking at the agencies who've been doing this, right? Like the National Human Trafficking Hotline, OVCT Tech, maybe Shared Hope. The Freedom Network even has some really great stuff about labor trafficking. And so really looking at some of these bigger agencies that are really doing this work and seeing who's connected to who, because there always is those like who's working with who, and really figuring out like, oh, well, they're not working with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Why not? They're not working with the state. Why not? Because we cannot do this alone. The agencies who are doing this work and who know we're working together, we're collaborating together, because we realize that not one agency can do this alone. And we're checking each other and we're saying, what about this and what about this? And everything's not perfect, but the more reputable people and like that you can cross-reference of who's working with who and who's vouching for who, I think the better. And if you have questions, maybe reach out and start asking them. But if it's super sensationalized, I would start really kind of putting my thinking cap on and some just thinking about, is this the reality, and what are they actually doing on a daily basis, and where is the money going, and what services are they offering for victims?
Right. How do you find out if people are partnering with one another? Would it be on websites? Would it be on a task force page?
It's on task force pages, or a lot of times nonprofits, they have at the bottom of like who they partner with or their donors or different things like that. We have in Oregon, we certify all of our task forces that we work with, and there's contacts of them and their whole rosters. And so if there's an agency that isn't working with a community that has a task force, I would love for them to be at the table, because we want everybody at the table with a consistent, concise message and focus. And
I want to point out though, because I've seen some non-credible nonprofits who have a partners page and all the names look really great, but they're none of them are like any government or other nonprofits. It's just like bigger funders, like, oh, I got funding from Gates Foundation. Well, I got the funding from this, I got the funding from that. And just a list of funders doesn't equate to great partnerships always. Like if that's the only thing they're touting, be careful that you're not like, well, why aren't you on the task force? Well, why aren't you on this community advisory committee? Or why aren't you, if this is so reputable, why aren't we seeing you show up in anti-trafficking spaces?
Right. Absolutely. Not just the donors. It's the what work are you actually doing?
Yeah.
Who are you collaborating with? And are you working with the system? The system is not perfect. There are a lot of flaws. We see that today more than ever, but we have to work within it to change it and fix it. And we need agencies and people who will work with us. We need to report child abuse. We cannot hide children that are being abused, right? We have systems in place so that we can make sure that they have services and that they have trauma-informed services that can help support them. We have crime victims compensation to help with victims of crime and different things like that. And so you have to, if they're not working with the system, I would really start questioning what are they doing. If they're not working with other agencies too that are doing direct service, what are they actually doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is so good. Thank you so much, Amanda, for all your time today. I know you're very busy. You've got a lot of task forces to manage. You have so many projects that you're putting out. Where can people learn more about toolkits that the DOJ puts out, not just for Oregon, but is there places on all the different states' Department of Justice websites that puts out some of the things? I know you've got a lot of great content coming out, and you have had great content that's already come out. Like, where can people learn more by reading that stuff?
Well, I think that really looking at your Attorney General's task force page,
Okay.
Some states have it at the governor's office. We just have it at our Attorney General's office. Federal DOJ or like OVC TTAC is a great one. Ours is just the state page with the Crime Victims and Survivor Services Division. There's a trafficking tab that has all the information of our localized task forces and contact information, and also my contact information if people have questions of how to get involved or how to connect. If there's something not happening in their community, I really want to work with people and figure out how we can start something and get services for these survivors and victims.
That's great. So if just a reminder then, people that are listening, if you're interested in really learning more about the trafficking in your community, go to your governor's website, our Attorney General's website, both of them, figure out what's going on in your state, who the task force is, who's heading the task force, who's on the task force. Those are your people in your community doing the boots on the ground work daily. Find out who they are, learn from them, learn from those websites. And then that OVC TTAC that Amanda mentioned, that stands for the Office of Victims of Crime. It's probably one of our largest overarching crime victims websites. And they definitely talk far beyond human trafficking, elder abuse, all sorts of different crimes against victims. But they have a huge section for human trafficking. They put on lots of webinars throughout the year. And they have lots of reports on there. But I think that's where we see a lot of the data of actual research of how many children are being trafficked, how many adults are being trafficked, what types of laws are taking place. So yeah, get to know a little bit more. Thank you so much again for joining us. You guys, that's a wrap. I want to thank our sponsor, #RealityCheckIt, for bringing all of this information to you today. Please make sure you check out our YouTube page where all of these guests have their entire full-length interview. And if you like what you're hearing and you like what you're seeing, please share it on social media, tag a friend. We want to get this information out to everybody that's interested in this topic. And stay tuned for an upcoming podcast where we explore all of this into anywhere where you watch your favorite shows. Thanks again.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to start over with nothing?
Human trafficking. It's the largest social justice issue of our time.
What happens to women and children after they escape, after they complete a program?
How do you start life over again with a renewed sense of purpose?
Elevate Academy was birthed from that.
Elevate is an online school that offers courses, mentors, small groups, in-person chapters, homework activities, and job opportunities.
So that survivors of human trafficking can start to actually dream again and then create steps to get there.
By partnering with us financially every month for 1 year, you not only change the course of a survivor's life, but also her children and her children's children.
But it doesn't stop there.